Hi, I'm Jay Andrews with Laguna Tools. Today we're going to talk bandsaws, and specifically the 18CX. This is our variable speed bandsaw, and this will allow you to cut wood and metal. Now your saw will arrive to you in a box on a pallet just like this. You'll want to walk around the saw when it's delivered, and should you note any damage, like we see the scuff right here, note it on the shipping receipt. When you open up the box and have a look inside, if there's any damage to your machine, make sure that you notify us within 48 hours so that we can file a shipping claim and get it resolved for you. Now you can see that we've packaged your bandsaw very well. It's secure in the container, and this really helps us to avoid shipping damage when it's on its way there to you. In the top, you're going to find several parts, and lift these out, get them set on the bench here. What you'll find is you'll find your fence rail, some of the scales for the fence knuckle. You'll find your hardware package up in here, as well as a flip stop, another hardware package, the fence, and then finally the table. The table is going to be the heaviest thing out of this top section, so if you can lift it out yourself, great. If not, get someone to help you. It's a pretty heavy cast iron table. Well, now that styrofoam is out of the way, you get your first view of the bandsaw, and this is beautiful. Now this is a very heavy component. It's the single heaviest component of the saw, and this is an area where we would tell you to get some friends together. Make sure you've got several people on hand to help you move this out. And there's several different ways to get this out. You probably want to avoid lifting the entire thing up and out because that's the heaviest way to do it. It's a little bit easier to cut the box off so you've got better access to the saw to kind of tip it out slowly. But definitely put your back belt on, get 2 or 3 friends to help you out because this is a heavy component here. Now I'm going to remove the box and get ready to tip it out. Now there's a number of ways to get the bandsaw down and off. I find that one of the easier ways is to cut the styrofoam out of the way and to tip the saw out forward using a couple of people. So let's go ahead and get that done. I'll score the styrofoam on the bottom, so I'm not going to scratch the paint on the top. And now it's just about busting this out. Now I'm going to get most of the bag out of the way so I can get my hands right on the machine itself so I'm not working on a slippery bag. Now's a good time to take the miter gauge out of the way. Poke a hole through the bag, reach down, lift the miter gauge out. It's a little extra weight and it's something to flop around while you're trying to move the machine. Now I've got all the plastic removed. I've got the styrofoam swept up and busted out of the way. And now I've got a good purchase, a good handhold here on the saw. I'm going to grab some help, slide the bandsaw down, and then gradually tip it up, again using some help to get it off the pallet. Well, now the guys and I have slid the bandsaw forward on the pallet to where it just started to tip, and then stood it upright, right with the styrofoam and all. So now I'm going to remove the styrofoam and get ready for the next steps. Now in the parts and hardware bags, you're going to find the leveling feet with the bolts and washers. Locate those and get those ready to go. Now we get a few questions from time to time about what's the easiest way to install these feet on the saw. And I'll tell you from experience, it's easiest to install them when the saw is horizontal. It just makes it a lot easier. But I did it this way so I can show you a trick. So if you have stood your saw up and you need to install them, this will be the easiest way to do it. Grab a 4x4 that you can use to prop up the saw. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push backwards on the saw, tip it upright, kick this underneath it so I've got some elevation to install the feet. Position it right in front of the saw, right underneath the foot brake. Get someone to help you with this. Again, the saw is heavy. I'm going to push on this side, and I want somebody on the opposite side just so that it doesn't tip. And as I tip the saw back, I'll push it under with my foot. I want to make sure that I clear the corners as I tip it backwards. Okay, now the saw is up, it's off the ground, and I can put those feet on easily. Now grab the 6mm Allen wrench, insert the bolt, and then finally the washer, and insert these into the threaded hole in the bottom of the saw. Once it's started, secure it with the Allen wrench. Okay, now it's just time to kick out the 4x4 and repeat the process on the other side. Tip it back, kick it out, watch your toes, and repeat the process on the other side. The next step is to install the table. And again, it's a heavy cast iron table, so get it close to the saw. I like to prepare it to get things ready to go. First thing I'll do is I'm going to slit the plastic just so that I can work on the bottom, but I like to leave the plastic in place because the top is greasy. It's got a little packing grease or shipping grease on there to protect it. The next step is to go through and get the bolts lined up. Now you're going to see that half of the trunnions are mounted to the bottom of the table. The other half are mounted to the saw. You're going to drop these trunnions onto the other ones and center the bolts at the same time. So I'll get the bolts fairly well centered so that they drop in place. And as you flip the table over, these are going to hang and fall down. And your helper can help guide those bolts into the holes that are on the trunnions on the saw. Okay, perfect. Okay, now locate the two large locking handles and two washers, and these will go into the bolts that go through the trunnions on the bottom of the table. Now the trick on these locking handles is to push in the button, and as you're threading onto the shaft, just rotating this by the little knurled edge. That'll make it easier for you to start it. And once you have it positioned, then you can position the handle in the correct orientation to make it easy for you to lock and unlock the table. First, install the washer, install the handle, and again, push the button and hold it, and finally spin it onto the bolt. Now you can ratchet the handle and repeat the process for the backside trunnion. Now the table is protected with this cosmoline, kind of an oil substance, and the plastic. Time to peel it and clean that oil off. There's a number of different types of cleaners that you can use on your table. WD-40 actually works pretty good to cut through the oil and grease, and then you can certainly wipe it off. Today I'm using a little bit of alcohol, but you can use little mineral spirits or something like that. You just want to go through and cut the grease and then finally wipe it all dry. Once you're done cleaning it, it's not a bad idea to put a coat of wax on it. Something like Top Saver or Bow Shield works great for these type of cast iron tables. The next step is to install the scale or the front ruler onto the machine. Locate the two small bolts, grab an 8mm wrench, and these will install in the front holes. Now these are slotted so that you can adjust this from side to side once you get your blade on and start making some cuts. The next step is to install the front fence rail. This is a solid steel shaft that bolts to the front of the table using these long button head bolts, the two standoffs, and you'll find the Allen wrench supplied in the package. The standoffs will space the fence bar away from the front table like so. The first step is to go through and install the bolts onto the fence rail. And then position the standoff on the bolt, and then finally install it into the front of the table. Leave it a little bit loose so you can swing the other side into place, and then finally you'll tighten it down once you have both sets installed. Now, because these are machined into the table, they should self-level. If you need to make any adjustments later on, it'll only be minor adjustments. Got this secure. I'll tighten this up. Now we're ready for the fence. The next item is to install the fence knuckle. This is a cast knuckle. You've got a nice rubber handle on the front, and you want to actually back this off. There's a brass tip screw that locks onto the front rail. Make sure that that's backed all the way out of the way before sliding this on. And that way you can slide it all the way onto the machine. This will glide back and forth as you adjust your fence, and when you tighten it down, that little brass tip is going to engage the rod to secure it without scratching the surface. The next step is the fence face, and you can see just how heavy this extrusion is. It slides into a T-slot on the back of the fence, right over that key that's on the knuckle, and then it tightens down with the two lock handles that are on the back. Now you can see how tall the fence is, but it's a two-position fence. So simply loosen the knobs, slide it off, and back in position when it's in the low position. Now this allows you to go through and guide some small pieces through and run your hands out of the way of the fence so your hands don't get trapped between the fence and the blade. This is great for small parts and detail work, but most of the time you're going to use it in the upright position. Let's go ahead and reinstall it in the upright position so we can show you some other features of this fence. I like to set the end of it even with the front of the casting on the knuckle. And that'll tighten right down. And then I can loosen and adjust this back and forth and tighten it any place I want along the front rail. Now, one of the great new inclusions with this fence is that it has a flip stop. It's a nice heavy flip stop that goes into the T-slot that's at the rear top of the fence. And it simply inserts into that T-slot, and then there's a small lock handle on the back here, a little ratchet handle to tighten it in place. It can fold out of the way when not in use, or you can bring it forward as you're going through and cutting tenons or something where you need to make a cut and stop at a particular point. One of the best features about the flip stop is this scale, and it's a handy scale that lets you set the depth of your tenon cuts. It inserts into the back of the T-slot, and you'll put the 0 to the front and the larger numbers to the rear. Once you have a blade installed, you'll match the front edge of the blade with the 0 point, tighten down the screws. Then when you set your flip stop, you'll bring the flip stop back, measure the depth of your tenon, lock it into place, and when you hit the stop, you know that your tenon is only going to be the increment that you've set it at. Next up is the crank handle for the upper guide post hand wheel. This will thread right into the side of the hand wheel, just like this. And then you may need a wrench. This is a 14mm wrench to tighten it down into place. The lock knob for the upper guide post hand wheel is right here on the back. This loosens up the upper guide post and allows you to easily position it to match your workpiece. Once you have it set in place when you're cutting, you'll simply lock it in position here. The 18CX bandsaw will perform its best with a good quality blade on the saw. And Laguna makes a wide range of blades, from RESAW blades to Pro-Force blades that are great for curves, as well as bimetal blades for cutting metal. Today, we're going to start off with the RESAW King blade. Now, the RESAW King blade that we're going to install today is a nice wide blade, and that's great for doing straight line cuts. If you're doing curve cuts, you want to run a narrower blade, and there's a handy chart that's on the back of the box here that shows you some of the radius of cuts that you can get with different blades. It also shows you the 4 different categories that we offer blades in. Now, in order to get prepared to install the blade, there's a few things you have to do. First of all is loosen and remove this lock handle. The lock handle is used to anchor these two halves of the table together so you don't get any deflection. Next up is the throat plate insert. This removes with just a simple Phillips head screwdriver. Set that to the side. Pop the plate out. Now, you may still have a little bit of grease inside to clean up. Go ahead and wipe that down. Next up, I'm going to go through and back off the guides. There's an upper set of guides and a lower set of guides. Let's get those backed off and ready to receive the blade. The upper guides have a lock handle on the side. Simply loosen the handle, push the guides rearward, and lock them in position. And then you can open up the side guides by loosening these two knobs, pulling those apart, and anchoring those in position. Now, under the table, you can access these two knobs in the back for the lower guides. Simply loosen the one on the inside and the outside and slide the entire guide back. Finally, open up the sides of the guide to accept the blade. Now hopefully you can see this through the opening in the top of the table. Loosen the side guides with the small thumb wheel. Do that to open up the slot in the blade. Repeat the process on the opposite side. Now you're ready to insert the blade into the guides. The 18CX takes a 145-inch blade, and in order to install it, we're going to lower this upper wheel. We can lower it, first of all, by using the hand wheel right here, and this is normally used to set the tension. There's also a quick release on the back that lowers the wheel. Now sometimes when the saw is brand new and it might have some of that packing grease in there, you may need to pull this down or just to tap it with a rubber mallet to loosen it and to let it down for the first time. That'll free up as you start using the saw, and then you'll see that the wheel goes up and down quite easily with the quick release lever. You may notice at this point that the upper flywheel feels loose and that you can pivot it, and that's completely normal. There's a knob on the back of the saw that sets the tracking for the blade, and the tracking is done by tipping that wheel back and forth at a precise amount to keep the blade centered. We'll see that in a little bit. Now to uncoil the bandsaw blade, simply let one end droop down a little bit and then grab the other sides and let it spring out. Just be careful, it's got a lot of spring tension in it. Now you'll notice that on this blade, the teeth are going downwards on the right hand side and upwards on the left, and that's how it should be in the saw. If you uncoil your blade and you notice that these teeth are pointed upwards on the side, you'll flip the blade inside out by grabbing the blade and just flexing it around and flipping it inside out, and that'll reverse the teeth. I'll go ahead and set this back the way that it was because it was correct, but you may notice that they point upwards, and just simply flip it inside out and you're ready to insert it on the bandsaw. The first step is to open up the blade guard. Next, underneath the table, remove the insert block that is in the slot on the saw. This is used to improve the dust collection on the saw. We'll talk about this later. Now to make the blade installation a little bit easier, I like to grab it kind of like a bow tie with a smaller loop on one side, a larger loop on the other side, and then simply insert it in the slot on the side, slide it through to the throat plate hole, and then swing it around. Now start raising your blade to drape it over the upper wheel and to feed it through the slot on the upper guide post. Finally, feed it through the slot on the frame side of the saw. Now come down and check the blade position on the lower flywheel, and you push it back if needed. What you'll want to see is that the blade is riding on the center of the wheel. Get it as close as you can right now. You may come back and readjust that in a little bit. Now with your hand, just go through and push the blade to where it's fairly well centered on the upper flywheel. It'll begin to center itself once we use the tracking knob. The first time you install and tension a blade on the saw, you'll probably end up turning the tension handle here more than you will at any other time during the operation of the saw. What I'll start doing is adding a little tension and then checking it with the quick release lever. And what I'm looking for is to see that the blade is starting to get some tension on it as I'm raising it. And right now you can see after turning the wheel several times, I'm getting a little bit of tension on the blade. I'll give it a little bit more right now. I'll bring the tension up, and now I can go through and start adjusting the tension with this wheel. Later on, once you have the tension set for this length, you'll be able to take the tension off and put the tension back on simply by releasing the quick release lever. Now the gauge indicator is magnetic. It can be removed and inserted. Because I like where I'm at with the tension, I'll go through and set this. Now I can go back and repeat that same measurement each time I install a blade. Now setting the blade tension is a matter of feel with the bandsaw, and I call it a rule of thumb. What I want to see is about a 1/4 inch deflection with my thumb with moderate pressure. And people ask, what is moderate pressure? It's when your thumbnail starts to change color as you're pressing on the blade. I'm going to need a little bit more tension, so I'll crank a little bit in with the tension wheel. The gauge is going to come up, and this is an 1¼ inch blade. So once we have this tension set where we like it, and that's about a 1/4 inch right there, I can go through and position the tension indicator perfect for my 1¼ inch blade. You can do this with the other blades, and this will give you an indication that you're close, and you can set the final setting by giving it the thumb test. Order of operations on a bandsaw setup is really important. The first step is setting that tension like we just did. The next is tracking. And what we'll do is we'll look through this tracking window on the side, and we're going to spin the wheel by hand with the power unplugged, and I'm going to observe the blade. Now right now, just with a quick turn, it's way off of the front of the wheel, and I want to center the blade on the wheel. So I'll continue spinning and then unlock and turn the tracking knob on the back of the saw. Now rotating the knob clockwise will move the blade backwards. To center the blade on the wheel. As I'm turning the wheel, I'm turning this knob. Okay, now I'm a little far back. I'm going to go ahead and release some of that pressure. And that's great. Now the bandsaw blade is centered on the tire and wheel, and we're ready to go to the next step. Once you're done with the tracking, lock the center lock knob, and that'll keep the tracking from moving. Next step is to go through and close the guard on the upper guide post and to reinsert the insert block. Now this insert block is plastic, and it's plastic for a reason. It sits down in the slot right next to the blade. The blade is actually going to travel through this slot, and it may move around or rattle around a little bit, and it may come in contact with the blade, and that's completely normal. This is a replaceable insert. You can even make these out of plywood. We sell these on our website as well. But this will go through and seal off the lower chamber to improve the dust collection on your saw. Before adjusting the upper guides, make sure that the upper guide post is locked by using the lock knob on the back. If it's loose, you'll have a little bit of play in the upper guide post. By tightening this lock knob down, it makes it rock solid. Now I can go through and adjust my guides with confidence. Adjusting the upper guides starts with moving the thrust shaft forward to where the thrust bearing, the ceramic thrust bearing on the front of the shaft, just touches the back of the blade. Loosen the lock knob, slide the shaft forward to where it just barely touches the back edge of the blade. Don't push hard enough to deflect the blade, just kiss the back of the blade, tighten this down, and then I'll use this ratcheting handle to point it backwards so that it's out of the way. The next adjustment is to slide the entire assembly forward and back along the shaft to where the edges of the side guides are behind the gullet or the cutout of the tooth. If those come in contact with the tooth itself or with this little gullet, it can cause damage to your blade or the ceramics. Bring this forward. You want to have it about 1/8 of an inch or so behind that gullet, and then simply lock this in place. Now is a good time to level it also from side to side. We'll get this fairly level, about 1/8 of an inch behind that gullet, and lock it in place. Now I'm going to bring the side guides in toward the blade, and they're going to make contact both on the top and bottom ceramic. What I'll do is loosen this up, bring it in from the side to where it just barely touches the blade, and I'll lock it in place on this side. Now I can repeat the process on the opposite side. Push it in to where it just barely touches the blade, no pressure at all, and lock it in position. The blade should pull easily through those guides. Now if you have a blade that has a thicker weld than we do here on the RESAW King blade, you may want to space those out very slightly just by putting a piece of paper between the blade and the guide itself. Adjusting the bottom guides is essentially the same as adjusting the top. We want to have the ceramics in the same position when we're cutting. In order to show this a little bit easier, I've removed the table. It's hard to see it and to film it when the table is in the way. You can normally make the adjustments coming in from the side to loosen the knobs and make the adjustment. The first thing that I'll do is I'll loosen this knob that lets the thrust bearing slide back and forth with inside the guides itself. And this knob can be moved to the outside or to the inside depending on which way you're going to be tilting your table. It has a hole on this side as well as this side. I'm going to loosen this up, and it allows the thrust bearing to go through and to float now with inside the guides. I'll simply move the entire assembly forward to where the gullets clear the ceramics here by about 1/8 of an inch or so, and then I'll lock the forward motion in place. Then I'll go through and just make sure that the ceramic just barely touches the back edge of the blade, lock it down with this knob, and then finally I'll go through and push the side ceramics into where they just barely touch the blade. You don't want to put too much force, you don't want to deflect the blade. Just come in and lightly touch it, lock it in place, lightly touch it, lock it in place. Make sure those are snug. Now your guides are adjusted. The blade, again, should pull through nice and smooth without any binding at all. You'll see that the weld on this blade passes through smoothly. Again, if you have a thicker weld on your blade and need some more clearance, put a piece of paper between the ceramics and the blade on each side and then set the adjustment. Now we're ready to go through and adjust the fence. We've put the table back on just like you would normally have it. Now we're going to reinsert the lock knob into the edge of the table. Insert this, line the nut up, and tighten it down to lock those two table halves together. The next step is to insert and level the throat insert for the saw. Now this sits a little bit low right now, all the way around. We'll grab an Allen wrench and raise this up to the level of the table. And take your time, do each corner one at a time. Sometimes it takes another pass to make sure that you've got everything leveled correctly. You want to make sure that this is as flush to the edge of the table as you can get it without being over. If it's over, your material will catch on it as it's sliding through. Now we're going to go through and check the table to blade squareness. I'll do that just with a simple square, bring it up to the edge of the blade, and you can see that this one is grossly out of adjustment. That's because we haven't leveled the table, and that's the next step. You can see that the table itself will tilt on the trunnions, just back and forth, and right now I've got it loosened up so you can tilt it pretty easily. The adjustment for this is down underneath the table. There's a small nut and bolt that will adjust to bring this into square. Let's go underneath the table and set that adjustment. The adjustment is done using this bolt. This bolt will rest on the pad on the inside of the frame right here. Normally when you're tilting the saw further inwards, you can swing this away to allow that bolt to go down through the frame of the machine to get a further inward tilt for certain cuts. Right now, to level it off, I'm going to close off that hole, lower the bolt down, and then gradually turn it outwards to bring the table into square with the blade. Now you'll watch the table come into level as I ratchet this bolt to set the table 90 degrees square to the blade. Now we're getting pretty close. Just a bit more. Boy, that is right on now. Now that the table is 90 degrees to the blade, I'll go through and tighten up the jam nut on this bolt. I'll get it in position by finger, take my ratchet out, and lock it in position. Now that the table is square to the blade, we want to go through and adjust the pointer to read 0. Simply loosen the screw, move the pointer to where it's pointing up at 0, and secure the screw. This will give you the opportunity to go through and adjust the table tilt later on to known increments by using the gauge on the bottom of the trunnion. Now continuing on with the initial setup of the table and fence assembly, I want to make sure that the fence is locked down to the front rail, and I'm going to check the fence for square using a square to the table. Now we know that the blade is square to the table. That tells us that the table is level, but the fence is a little bit out of square in the vertical position. In order to adjust that, I'll use an Allen wrench, and there's 2 small screws in the side of the fence. Loosen the 2 lock knobs and adjust these 2 little screws. It takes only very small adjustments on these upper and lower screws to make an adjustment on the fence, and you want to do those adjustments while these lock knobs are loose. I think I've got it set there. I'm going to lock these down. Check the square, and it looks like we're right on now. And then once you've got those adjusted, tighten it back down, check it for square. You might have to repeat this process a couple of times just to get this exactly 90 degrees to the table. Making the adjustment for the table to be square to the blade and for the fence to be square to the table is a one-time adjustment. Take your time right now, make sure those adjustments are set fine. If you do it right now, you won't have to do those later on. The next step is something that you'll do quite often, and that's adjusting the fence to the way that the blade is cutting. We call this the drift angle. Okay, I've just plugged in the bandsaw, so now we have power, and I've grabbed a scrap of wood. We're going to use this for the drift angle adjustment. Now that the saw has power, we can go through and check the emergency stop and the foot brake on the saw. First, pull out the emergency stop button and power up the saw. And you can check the e-stop. Now it's important to note that our e-stop works. I'm going to go through and pull this out, and you can bump this anytime you need to shut off the saw with your elbow, with your hand, but there's also one other way to shut off the saw, and that's with the foot brake. The foot brake not only shuts off the saw, but it stops the blade from spinning. Let's start it up and I'll show you the foot brake. And you can see it shuts off the saw, but it stops the blade much quicker. The drift angle adjustment sets the fence to be parallel with the blade, but not just parallel with the blade in a static condition, but parallel to the way that the blade actually cuts. Some blades may cut a little bit different than another blade. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this drift adjustment using a scrap of wood, making a test cut and seeing how it cuts. The first step is to move the fence over, lock the fence so you know that it's square, and turn on the saw, make a cut a few inches into the piece of wood, and then stop the blade in the cut, and we're going to observe the back edge of the blade in the kerf to make sure that it's centered. Okay, now that we have a cut in the piece of wood, we can observe the back edge of the blade. The tooth is going to make the cut or make the curve. The back edge of the blade is just going to follow along. And I can see I've got a nice gap on this side, but the other side is tight. And that lets me know that my fence is too far this way. And what I need to do is just make a small adjustment to bring the fence, the back of the fence, toward the inside frame of the saw so that we have an equal curve or equal gap on the back edge of the blade. Adjusting the fence drift angle is a matter of loosening the anchor bolts that anchor this fence block into the knuckle. There are 3 bolts right here. I usually like to loosen, just slightly loosen 2 of them and leave the center one tight. And that lets me move the fence without moving it too much. So simply insert the 6mm Allen wrench and loosen the front one, loosen the back one. And I don't like to loosen them too much. Now that those are loose, I can go through and adjust the fence, and adjusting the fence is easiest done by walking around back and just giving it a little tap to make the adjustment. Come back up front and tighten those 2 down. You may have to repeat this step a few times. What I've done is I've gone through and moved the back edge of the fence over. Now I'm going to make another test cut, but first I'm going to have to slide the fence over so I have a fresh cut in the board. So let's slide that over a little bit and make another cut. Okay, now with the saw stopped, I can see that I've got a gap on this side, a little bit more on this side. I'm going to adjust it one more time just to make sure it's dead on. Again, you may have to repeat this step a few times just to get it perfect. And once you have it perfect, it'll be set and you're ready to go through and cut. I'm going to go through, move the fence over a little bit, make one more test cut, and make sure we're right on. Okay, I've got a little gap on this side, about a matching gap on this side, and that's perfect. Now today, in setting up this bandsaw from scratch, we've made a few adjustments that are one-time adjustments, like the 90-degree square to the blade and the table, the 90-degree from the table to the fence. Once you have those set, you won't have to do those again, but the steps that you will take over and over again anytime you replace a blade are setting the tension, setting the tracking, setting the guides, and then finally adjusting the fence. And you need to do those in that order in order to get the best quality cuts you possibly can out of your bandsaw. Again, tension, tracking, guides, and fence, and you'll have perfect cuts. Now that the bandsaw is completely set up and adjusted, it's ready to run and put through its paces. And what makes the 18CX exceptional is that it's a variable speed bandsaw. It's got two ranges. It's got a high range from 1200 to 3500 RPM, and it's got a low range that goes from 100 to about 230 RPM. And that allows us to do a wide range of different materials. I'm going to start off with wood, and I'm going to run the wood in the high range. Let me walk you around back and show you how to change the speeds on the 18CX. Now over here at the back of the bandsaw, you'll see the motor in the back, and the motor is connected to this gearbox. And the gearbox changes the speed from the high range to low range, and that's controlled through this lever. This lever can be moved only when the saw is in the off position. So with the saw off, I also like to unplug it just to make sure that we don't damage the saw. You can shift the lever. You simply pull forward and slide the lever forward, and this will go to the neutral position. If you're having any trouble moving the lever, just slightly rotate the wheel with your other hand as you're shifting it. And you'll see that the lever moves nice and free. Now it's in the neutral position now. If I go to the back position, I'll rotate the handle down slightly. That'll lock it in the low position, or when you go back to the high position, you can slide it forward and push it down, and that leaves it in the high position. Now the high position puts you in the high range. That range is from 1200 to 3500 RPM. And you can see the RPM gauge here on the back. There's an indicator right here. And in order to change the speed within the high range, you'll go through and unlock this handle, and then you can go through and crank the speed handle right here. And this is normally done when the bandsaw is in the on position. So as you're running the saw, you can turn this and it changes the diameter of the drive pulley inside. When you're adjusting the speed with the knob on the side, you'll see that the pulley changes. And normally you wouldn't run the saw with the doors open. I've got the doors open right now. We're going to stay clear, but I'm going to show you what happens with the pulleys on the inside. First, I'll have to start the saw. And you can see the diameter of the pulley changing where it touches the belt. And that'll change the speed of the flywheel and of the blade. Now this is a slower speed. I'm going to go through and crank it back the other way, and you'll watch the belt climb its way out of the groove. And you can hear the speed of the saw and the blade increasing as you do this. That's all the way out in the fast position. I'll lock it so that it doesn't change speeds as we're running it. And finally, I'll stop it before I come around and close the door. For the first cut, we're going to do some RESAW work. I've chosen this piece of ambrosia maple. Now when you're setting up for a RESAW cut, you want to make sure that you do a few things. First of all, have the right blade on here. I've got the RESAW King blade on. It does a fantastic job. You want to make sure that you raise the upper guide post to the same height as your wood. And you also want to make sure that you use a blade that is the widest blade that your saw will accept anytime you're doing a straight line cut. The reason you want to do that is it gives you more beam strength in the blade, and it also puts more blade in the guides. For the 18CX and for our 18BX, I always choose the 1¼ RESAW King blade. I've got this set just above my wood height here. I'm going to go through and adjust the fence from the front, and we're about ready to cut. Now we're going to do a full height RESAW cut. So I've got the upper guides there just above the piece. I line up my material. That's going to be my cut right here. I'll get the fence locked in. All right, now I'm ready to turn on dust collection and put this through the saw. Make sure you've got your safety glasses on right here. Anytime that you're resawing, you're going to make a lot of sawdust. So you want to make sure that you've got your bandsaw hooked up to a good dust collector. We recommend a Cyclone style dust collector. Today I've got the P-Flux. You can use the C-Flux or the X-Flux series machines. They'll all do a great job here. The best thing about this is the remote. Now I can slide the fence over out of the way and have a look at this cut. There's our cut face. This would be our veneer piece if I was cutting veneers. I've cut this one just a little bit thick, but you can see what a beautiful book match this is and what great results you get off the RESAW King blade. Next up, we're going to go through and do a curved cut, and I thought I would clean up this piece here. This is a scrap piece of wood that we carved the koi fish into a while back. It's got this giant hole and I want to clean it up a little bit. So I'm going to put a smaller blade on, and that'll let me do some of the curves to cut a little perimeter around this koi fish. For curve work, I like to use the Proforce blades. This is a 1/4 inch by 6/2 per inch. It'll give me nice detail work on here, and it cuts pretty quick. I've removed the fence. It gives me a little more room on the table to swing this piece around. Let's go ahead and get cutting. Well, I've got a nice rough cut here on the fish. I'll come back and detail it up with some nicer cuts and some sanding and some carving. That's going to look great. You can see the versatility of the 18CX by just a simple blade change. Now, let's cut some metal. I'm going to do another blade change and also change the speed. Now, I'm set up for some metal cutting. I've installed a 1/2 inch bimetal blade, and this is a variable pitch tooth that breaks up the harmonics when you're cutting. It's a 6 to 10 tooth per inch variable pitch blade. I've got a 1/2 inch thick piece of aluminum. I've moved the fence to the low position so I can glide my hand over the top of the fence as I guide this piece through the saw. Now I'm not going to cut all the way through it. I'm going to make a stepped cut or a little notch cut, and so I'm going to come over here and set the stop for that cut. One of the great things about the flip stop is it not only works for the fence in the tall position, it has this short fence, and this is great for the fence when it's in the low position. This will allow me to bring the metal in, make a stop cut with the flip stop. Well, you can see just how nice of a cut this made in the aluminum. Now, you could just as easily cut plastic, foam, or any other number of different types of materials by altering the blade speed, changing out the blade to get the quality that you need in your cut. I'm going to try a few more cuts here on some different materials. That's fantastic. This is some nice thin-walled steel tubing, and you can see what a nice cut it does in this as well. Well, you can really see what a versatile tool the 18CX bandsaw is. With the variable speed, using a different combination of blades, we can go through and do RESAW work, curves and circles and woods. You can cut plastics, which we didn't do today, but you can cut aluminum, aluminum plate, some steel, bar stock, you can cut tubing. The possibilities are endless. Now, to make your work a little bit more pleasurable, you may want to install one of the optional work lights. We've got 3 different lights to choose from that mount right directly to the saw. There's even an outlet on the back to plug it into. You may also want to get one of the mobility kits so you can move the saw around your shop just a little bit easier. If you have any other questions on this saw or any of our products, feel free to give us a call toll free at 800-234-1976 or look us up on the web at lagunatools.com.